In the high country of Medicine Bow, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1919, the neighbors started to talk. They talked about the new man, Elias Thorne, the former Navy man who'd bought the old Miller homestead. He was quiet, kept to himself, but it was what he was building that made them stare. He wasn't building a barn. He wasn't digging a new root cellar. He was building a low circular wall of stone in the middle of his yard, dry stacked, maybe 3 feet high and 12 feet across. Inside this ring, he wasn't building a fire pit. He was stacking his winter wood, not in a normal rick, not in a lean-to against the cabin. He was stacking it in a circle, like a giant squat chimney of split pine and aspen. People riding past would slow their horses. They'd watch him place each log with meticulous care. Bark side up, angled slightly down and out. It looked strange, unnatural, a monument to foolishness. They thought he'd lost his mind to the wind and the altitude. And when the winter of 1920 hit, a winter that would be spoken of in whispers for 50 years, that crazy stone ring and the woodpile that looked like a tombstone would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to see the number that made the county's best lumberman go silent, a number that redefined warmth itself, stay until the end. What did this quiet outsider, this veteran of distant oceans, understand about firewood that every rancher and logger in Wyoming had missed? If you enjoy stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom, consider subscribing and drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. Elias Thorne wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old former Navy Seabee, a man who'd spent 15 years building things in places God never intended for men to live. He'd laid foundations in the frozen mud of Adak, Alaska, and framed barracks in the steaming humidity of the Philippines. He understood one thing better than most. Weather is not an opponent you can fight. It's an engine you have to understand. You don't defeat moisture, you guide it. You don't stop wind, you use it or deflect it. He'd come to Wyoming with his wife Sarah and their 2 young daughters, Clara and June, seeking quiet, seeking air that didn't smell of salt and diesel. He built them a solid cabin, tight chinked with oakum he'd learned to use on ships. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. It was tight, sturdy, and faced south to catch the winter sun. He thought he was prepared. Then came their first winter, the winter of 1918. It was a brutal education. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that pressed against the walls, seeking any crack, any weakness. The temperature dropped to 20 below in December and stayed there. The wind never stopped. It was a constant, keening pressure from the northwest, stripping heat from the log walls with terrifying efficiency. Elias had laid in what he was told was a sufficient supply, 5 cords of pine stacked neatly in a lean-to against the north wall of the cabin, just as everyone else did. It was supposed to be the driest, most protected spot. But the wood, cut just that summer, never seemed to truly dry. Every log he brought inside hissed in the stove. It sizzled and steamed, reluctant to catch fire. The cabin was filled with a thin, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and never quite went away. The heat it produced was sullen, weak. He was feeding the cast-iron stove every 2 hours, day and night. The firebox was a hungry ghost that was never satisfied. His daughters slept in their coats, huddled under a mountain of quilts. His wife, Sarah, spent her evenings stuffing rags along the baseboards, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Frost bloomed in feathery patterns on the inside of the walls. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. They weren't living in their home. They were surviving in a shelter. They burned through all 5 cords by the end of February and had to buy 2 more at an inflated price from the local lumberman, Jedediah Finch. That spring, as the relentless wind finally softened, Elias didn't just think about the cost in dollars. He thought about the cost in effort, in comfort, in dignity. He'd watch his neighbors, men born and raised in this country, doing the exact same thing. They'd complain about green wood, about the endless chore of feeding the stove, about the constant, bone-deep chill that lasted from November to April. They accepted it as a fact of life, a hardship to be endured with grim stoicism. Elias didn't see it as a hardship to be endured. He saw it as a physics problem that hadn't been solved. The problem wasn't the stove. The stove was efficient. The problem wasn't the cabin's insulation. For a log structure, it was excellent. The problem, he realized, was the fuel. The wood itself was the source of its own inefficiency. He remembered a lesson from an old shipwright in Bremerton. They were working with massive timbers for a dry dock, and the old man had told him, "Wood holds 2 kinds of water, son. There's free water in the cell cavities. That leaves easy. Then there's bound water inside the cell walls themselves. Getting that out, that takes time and air. Lots of air." Every pound of water in a log, Elias calculated, had to be heated to 212 degrees Fahrenheit and converted to steam before the wood fiber itself could combust. That took an immense amount of energy. The hissing sound from his stove wasn't just noise. It was the sound of his heat being stolen. He was spending half his fire's energy just boiling water out of his own fuel. The wood wasn't just fuel, it was wet fuel. And wet fuel was a thief. The community's solution, the lean-to against a north wall, was fundamentally flawed. It protected the wood from snow, yes, but it shaded it from the sun. It blocked the prevailing winds, creating a pocket of dead, damp air. And worst of all, the wood was stacked tight, preventing air from circulating through the pile. Ground moisture wicked up into the bottom logs, and rain driven by swirling eddies would soak the ends. It was a wood shelter, not a wood dryer. His mind went back to the Seabees, to the problem of drying concrete in humid environments, of preventing mold in sealed Quonset huts, of using solar radiation and passive airflow. He'd seen engineers build strange-looking structures for very specific purposes. Form had to follow function. His plan began to form. It was simple in principle. He needed to get every single log in his woodpile surrounded by moving air. He needed to use the sun's energy, weak as it was in winter, to create warmth. And he needed to lift the entire pile off the damp ground. He wasn't just going to store his wood. He was going to season it actively. In late summer, when a local rancher was clearing a field of glacial till, Elias saw his opportunity. He bought 2 wagon loads of the rounded stones for $10. It was back-breaking work, moving them himself with a wheelbarrow. Sarah watched him with a worried line on her brow, but she didn't question him. Not yet. He was a man who saw things in systems, and she had learned to trust his process, even when it made no sense to her. As he laid the foundation, his neighbors began to notice, and the whispers began. He started by clearing a patch of ground in the sunniest, most wind-exposed part of his yard. He dug down 6 inches and laid a thick bed of coarse gravel for drainage, ensuring no moisture could ever wick up from the soil. On this bed, he began to build the ring, a dry stacked wall of those field stones, chosen and fitted with a shipwright's precision. No mortar, the gaps were intentional. They would allow air to pass through, but the stone itself would absorb the sun's heat. It would become a low-power thermal battery. Inside the ring, he built a raised platform of scrap lumber, keeping the first layer of wood a full foot off the gravel bed. Then he began to stack the wood. This was what truly baffled onlookers. He began by laying a radial pattern of logs like spokes on a wheel. Then he started building the outer wall of the woodpile a few inches inside his stone ring. He placed each piece of split pine with the bark side facing up. This was critical. Bark is nature's raincoat. It's designed to shed water. Placed bark up, the logs would naturally direct rain and snow melt outwards, away from the heart of the pile. As the circular wall of wood grew higher, he didn't fill the center with randomly tossed logs. Instead, he kept a hollow column in the middle, a chimney about 2 feet in diameter. He carefully angled the logs in the stack slightly downwards toward the outside. Any moisture that got in would be encouraged to drain out, not pool in the center. The main pile was composed of logs tossed in less precisely, but they were still placed to maximize air gaps. The narrator can now explain the physics. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. The dark stone ring would absorb solar radiation all day, even on cold, clear days. It would warm the air inside the ring. This slightly warmer air would then be drawn up through the central chimney, creating a constant, gentle convection current. It was a passive engine powered by the sun. Air would be pulled in through the base, flow through the entire stack of wood, and exit through the top of the central column. Every single log from top to bottom was in constant contact with a slow but steady stream of moving, dry air. It wasn't just covered, it was ventilated. It was a machine for drying wood. He worked for 2 weeks, a steady, unhurried pace. As he worked, the social interruptions began. A neighbor, Tom Colby, rode by and reined in his horse. "Building a well, Thorne?" he asked, a friendly curiosity in his voice. "Drying wood," Elias replied, not looking up from fitting a stone. Colby squinted at the structure. "Looks like a lot of work for a wood pile. My lean-to took me half a day." "We'll see," Elias said. It was his standard reply. When he was finished, it stood about 6 feet high and 12 feet across. A dense, circular fortress of wood sitting inside a ring of stone. It held 4 cords of wood, meticulously stacked. From the outside, it looked like a primitive grain silo or some strange pagan altar. It was tidy, it was solid, and it was utterly alien to the landscape of traditional Wyoming homesteads. The total cost was laughable. The $10 for the stone, a few dollars for the gravel, and his own labor. He'd spent less than $15, but the cost to his reputation was just beginning. That evening, Sarah came out to look at the finished structure. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. She looked at the woodpile, then back at the cabin, then at the long, disapproving stares of a family passing in a wagon on the road. "Elias," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet anxiety, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Elias wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze steady on his work. "Let them," he said. "We're not trying to stay warm on their opinions." But the opinions were coming, and when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw eccentricity. They saw pride. They saw a man who thought he was better than them. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with Jedediah Finch. Finch ran the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley. He was a man whose authority on lumber was unquestioned. He drove his truck out to the Thorne place one Saturday, ostensibly to see if Elias needed anything from town, but really to inspect the monstrosity he'd been hearing about. Finch was a big man, with hands like slabs of pine. He walked around the stone ring, kicking at it with his boot. He picked up a piece of the stacked firewood, sighting down its length. He grunted. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble of certainty. "I've been handling wood in this country since before you were born. I can tell you right now, this is a mistake." Elias stood by, his arms crossed, waiting. "That stone," Finch explained, pointing a thick finger. "It's going to get bone cold, colder than the air. Any bit of moisture in the air is going to condense on it, turn to frost. It'll sweat. You've built a moisture trap. That wood at the bottom will be a block of ice by Christmas. The rest will be rotten with mold come spring. You'd have been better off leaving it on the ground." It was a technical objection, and it sounded reasonable. It was based on a lifetime of conventional experience. "Perhaps," Elias said, his voice level. "Just trying something different, Jedediah." Finch shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Different isn't always better. There's a reason we do things the way we do. It's been tested." He left, and the story of his professional assessment spread through the valley like fire in dry grass. The cruelty came next. At the Mercantile, where men gathered around the pot-belly stove, a loud-mouthed ranch hand named Silas made sure everyone could hear him. Elias was there, buying flour and salt. "Heard Thorne ain't just stacking his wood," Silas boomed, a smirk on his face. "He's building it a fancy tombstone for when it freezes to death." A few men laughed. Others just shuffled their feet, embarrassed but unwilling to contradict the consensus. Elias paid for his goods, nodded to the storekeeper, and left without a word. The nickname stuck. People started calling it Thorne's Tomb. The gossip network was relentless. At the weekly quilting circle, the women would ask Sarah about it, their questions coated in a thick layer of feigned concern. "Is Elias feeling all right, dear? It must be so difficult adjusting to the climate here." The conversations would go quiet when she entered the room. Her quiet dignity was mistaken for shame. Even the institutions weighed in. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, paid a formal visit. He was a man who lived by university pamphlets and agricultural bulletins. He carried a clipboard and made careful notes. "Mr. Thorne," he said, peering at the structure through his spectacles. "It's an inventive construction, but it's not in any manual I've seen. The State University recommends a 3-sided, covered lean-to with the open side facing south for optimal air drying. Does it mention elevating the pile and ensuring airflow through the center?" Elias asked. Abernathy flipped through his papers. No, it does not. It specifies stacking in tight ricks to maximize storage space." "I'm not trying to store it. I'm trying to dry it," Elias said. Abernathy made another note. "I'll have to file a report on this as an unconventional method. I can't officially recommend it." He left, leaving behind a whiff of bureaucratic disapproval. But the cut that went deepest came from family. Sarah's brother, David came for Sunday dinner. He was a good man, but a man who cared deeply about community standing. After the girls were in bed, he spoke to Elias, man to man. His voice was laced with genuine worry. "Elias," he began, swirling the coffee in his cup, "I'm hearing things, in town, at the Grange." Elias waited. "People think you're being prideful. They think that because you were in the Navy, you think you know better than men who've lived here their whole lives. They're laughing, and it's getting back to Sarah." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "They're going to think you're either scared of the winter and overcompensating, or you're incompetent. Maybe both. Is it worth all that for a woodpile?" It was criticism framed as concern, and it was harder to deflect than open mockery. Elias looked at his brother-in-law, his expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, David. I'm trying to keep my family warm." By October, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a gray sky, not one person in the Medicine Bow Valley thought Elias Thorne had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn foolishness. They watched and they waited, certain that winter would deliver the final, brutal verdict. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Elias right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then November came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1920 is still recorded in Wyoming's climatology archives. It arrived not as a gradual slide, but as a sudden, violent assault. The first week of December, the temperature fell to -18 overnight and stayed there. The wind picked up, a steady 30-mile-per-hour gale that drove snow into drifts as high as a man. By December 12th, the thermometer on the mercantile porch read -31. On December 18th, it bottomed out at -38 degrees, with wind chills that the old-timers estimated at 60 below zero. For 23 consecutive days, the mercury never once climbed above zero. It was a dry, scouring cold that found every crack in a home, every weakness in a man's preparation. And the valley began to suffer. The carefully calculated cords of wood were being consumed at a terrifying rate. The Colby Ranch, Tom Colby's place, was burning through a cord and a half every 2 weeks, and his wife wrote in her diary that the main room of their well-built house never got above 45 degrees. Families that normally used half a cord a week were now burning that much in 3 days, just to keep the pipes from freezing solid. The fuel itself was failing them. The wood, stacked in the traditional lean-tos, was cold-soaked. The ends were often crusted with driven snow. When brought inside, it would sit by the stove for hours, dripping and thawing, before it could be burned. And when it did burn, it burned with that same sullen, hissing inefficiency Elias remembered from the year before. The air was thick with the smell of smoky, incomplete combustion. Jedediah Finch was working day and night, his truck struggling through the drifts to deliver emergency loads of wood to families that were running out. His own premium seasoned wood, which had sat for a year in his massive lean-tos, was burning just as poorly as everyone else's. He was getting complaints that his wood was wet. "It's not wet," he'd snap back. "It's just cold." Chimneys started to fail. The water vapor from the damp wood would rise, hit the brutally cold air at the top of the stone chimneys, and freeze, creating a thick layer of creosote and ice. The Williams family had a chimney fire that almost took their roof. The Jacksons' chimney plugged completely, filling their cabin with smoke and forcing them to move in with relatives. Livestock caught outside the barns were found frozen solid in the fields. Children were getting sick, a constant, rattling cough that echoed in the cold rooms. The doctor was making his rounds on horseback, his face a mask of ice. This wasn't just hardship. This was a slow-motion disaster. It was a battle of BTUs, and the people of Medicine Bow were losing. And then people started noticing the Thorn place. There was no sign of distress. The chimney on his cabin let out only a thin, almost invisible wisp of pale blue smoke, not the thick, gray, choking smoke that poured from every other chimney in the valley. A thin plume meant a hot, clean fire. A hot fire meant efficient fuel. Jedediah Finch, on a delivery run, saw Elias outside. The temperature was 20 below. Finch was bundled in a massive sheepskin coat and 2 layers of wool. Elias was splitting his next day's wood. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a wool vest, not a heavy coat. He wasn't even wearing gloves. He wasn't hurrying. He was working at a steady, calm pace, the axe rising and falling with an easy rhythm. The pieces of pine fell away clean, with a sharp crack, not the dull thud of frozen wet wood. It was a detail so wrong, so out of place in the landscape of universal suffering, that it was deeply unsettling. It didn't make sense. The doctor, making his rounds, stopped in to check on the Thorn children, as he was checking on all the families with young ones. He expected to find them huddled and coughing. He found them sitting at the kitchen table, drawing on pieces of paper, wearing simple wool dresses. The cabin was comfortable. The word began to spread, carried by the few who braved the roads. Something was different at the Thorn place. Something impossible was happening inside that small, tight cabin with the crazy woodpile out front. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It would be recorded in a state university bulletin a year later as a benchmark in fuel efficiency. The breaking point came on December 23rd. Jedediah Finch's own wood supply for his house was running low, and the wood he brought in from his commercial yard was burning as poorly as everyone else's. His wife was sick, and the house was a miserable 50 degrees. In an act of desperation, swallowing a dose of pride so bitter it almost choked him, he loaded his truck with a quarter cord of his best wood and drove to Elias Thorn's homestead. He told himself he was just checking on them, bringing an emergency supply like a good neighbor. In his heart, he knew he was going there to see a miracle or a lie. He pulled up, the truck engine groaning in the cold. He knocked on the door, his knuckles stinging. Sarah Thorn opened it. The first thing that hit him wasn't a sight or a sound. It was a feeling. A solid wall of warmth rolled out of the cabin, a wave of dry, radiant heat so profound it was like stepping into a different season. It was the kind of enveloping comfort he hadn't felt in 2 months. He was momentarily stunned. Behind Sarah, through the cabin opening, Finch saw the image that would crystallize the entire winter. The 2 girls, Clara and June, were on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. They were in simple cotton dresses and wool stockings, not coats, not blankets, dresses. "Jedediah," Sarah said, her voice calm. "Everything all right?" Finch found his voice. It was hoarse. "Just checking on you folks. Brought some extra wood in case you were running low." He gestured toward the truck. "That's very kind of you," she said, a small, knowing smile on her face. "But we're fine, Jedediah. We're managing just fine. Please come in out of the cold." He stepped inside. The air was warm, but it was also clean. There was no smoky haze, no smell of smoldering pine. He looked at the stove. It was glowing with a faint cherry-red heat, the damper turned down low. It was ticking over, not roaring. "You're sure you have enough wood?" he pressed, his professional pride searching for a logical explanation. "This cold is eating cords like candy." "Elias says we're burning less than half a cord every 2 weeks," Sarah said simply. Finch stared at her. "Half a cord? Sarah, people are burning a cord a week, and they're freezing. That's not possible." Elias came in from the back room carrying a few logs for the wood box. They were startlingly white and clean. He nodded at Finch. "Jedediah." Finch's eyes went to the wall thermometer, an old mercury and tin advertisement for a hardware store. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the wood floor. He squinted. The red line of mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 71 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. 71 degrees, while outside the world was locked at -38. A temperature difference of 109 degrees. It was an impossible number. It defied everything he knew. He reached out a hand and touched the interior log wall. It was cool, but not cold. It wasn't weeping frost. He looked back at the thermometer as if it might be lying. Elias saw the look on his face. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't gloat. He simply walked over to the wood box, picked up a split log, and handed it to Finch. The piece of pine felt impossibly light in Finch's hand, as if it were hollow. The cut ends were bone dry, smooth to the touch, with no hint of dampness or frost. Elias took the log back, held it up, and tapped it with his knuckle. It made a sharp, clear, ringing sound, like a piece of hardwood, like glass. Then Elias picked up a poker from the hearth and handed it to Finch. "Go get a log from your truck," he said. Finch went out into the brutal cold, pulled a log from his own premium supply, and brought it inside. It felt heavy, dense, and cold as stone. The end grain was dark, slick with frozen moisture. When Elias tapped it with the poker, it made a dull, lifeless thud, the sound of water. Elias had kept meticulous records, a habit from the Navy. He pulled out a small notebook. "I built an improvised moisture meter," he said, showing Finch a simple device with 2 sharpened nails and a galvanometer. "Your wood, Jedediah, is testing at about 35 to 40% moisture content. Mine," he pointed to his own log, "is at 12%. He began to explain the physics, simply and without condescension. "Every pound of water takes over 1,000 BTUs of heat just to turn to steam. Before the wood can even burn, your stove is working as a water boiler. For every 10 pounds of your wood, you're trying to burn almost 4 pounds of water. I'm burning a little over 1 pound. The difference in available heat isn't incremental, it's categorical." He showed Finch the numbers. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords a month to hold 45 degrees. The Williams Cabin, 1.8 cords a month to hold 48 degrees. Elias Thorne's cabin, 0.7 cords a month to hold 71 degrees. Finch looked at the numbers. He looked at the comfortable room. He looked at the children playing happily in their dresses. He looked at the small, quiet stove putting out an impossible amount of heat. He finally understood. He hadn't been selling fuel. He'd been selling a problem. The entire valley had been doing it wrong. for generations. He walked to the door and turned, his face etched with a new, humbling understanding. He looked Elias Thorne in the eye. "I've been in the lumber business for 30 years, Jedediah Finch said, his voice quiet but clear. "We've been doing this wrong for 70. He left the quarter cord of wood where it was. He said it was a down payment on a lesson learned. The story of Jedediah Finch's visit spread faster than the cold. Word of Thorne's warm cabin and the impossible number, 71 degrees, became a legend in the space of a week. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a stunned, curious respect. The first convert was Tom Colby. His youngest son was sick with pneumonia, and the doctor had told him point blank that the boy would not recover in a house that stayed below 50 degrees. Desperate, Colby rode over to the Thorne place, his hat in his hands. He didn't ask for wood. He asked for knowledge. Elias spent a morning with him, not just showing him the structure, but explaining the principles: the gravel base, the stone heat sink, the central chimney for airflow, the bark up stacking. "It doesn't have to be this big," Elias explained. "The principles are what matter: elevation, ventilation, and solar gain." Colby and his two older sons built a smaller version, a 6-foot circle, in a single frantic day. They stacked their remaining wood according to Elias's method. It wouldn't have time to fully season, but Elias showed him how to place the driest pieces he could find in the sunniest, best ventilated spots. Within 2 weeks, Colby told everyone at the Mercantile that the wood he was now burning was noticeably drier and hotter. His house was holding 60 degrees, and his son was recovering. That was all the proof the valley needed. By that spring, 7 families had built thorn stacks in their yards. By the following summer, there were 12 more. The strange-looking wood piles were becoming a common sight. People would share innovations. Some used stacked railroad ties for a base. Others built a taller stone wall. But the core principles Elias had laid down were always there. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, returned in the spring, this time with a calibrated, university-issue moisture meter. He spent a day with Elias, testing logs from the center of the pile and the outside. He recorded the data with a kind of hushed reverence. The lowest reading was 11.8% moisture content. He published a special bulletin for the Wyoming Agricultural Extension Service titled "An Unconventional but Highly Effective Method for Seasoning Firewood in High-Altitude Climates." It was circulated to every county in the state. The idea spread. Variations began to appear in Colorado and Montana, adapted for local conditions. What Elias Thorne had built in his yard, based on fundamental physics he'd learned in the Navy, was slowly rediscovering a truth that predated modern science. He had, by nearly a century, anticipated the principles of modern building science: thermal mass, passive ventilation, and moisture management. Years later, when a young journalist came to interview him about the famous Wyoming woodpile, Elias was a grandfather, his hands gnarled but strong. He was sitting on his porch, looking out at the stone ring, which was now covered in moss, but still perfectly solid. The journalist asked him if he felt proud of his invention. Elias just shook his head slowly. "It's not new," he said, his voice the same calm, level tone it had always been. "It's just correct. The sun and the wind have been doing the work all along. All I did was get out of their way." The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for tradition's sake. It didn't care about opinions or mockery. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet observation of a man who understood that survival wasn't about fighting the elements, but about understanding the engine that drove them. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below and tell us your story. And for more proven frontier techniques every week, make sure you subscribe to our channel. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of events. The characters and specific names are fictional, but the techniques for drying wood and the principles of thermodynamics are based on real historical and scientific practices.